kind of simple, well, not simple, these kind of this kind of information sharing event helps people to understand and appreciate what has happened in the past. Now they could also do what Dr. Amabani has done. Right now we're going to hear from another doctor. This lady's name is Dr. Michelle Asantewa, and she's a lecturer at London Metropolitan University, and she's going to talk about her experiences of becoming a PhD holder in British society. So, give up to Dr.
Good evening. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Naya, for inviting me again to speak about my experiences. And thank you, Emma, for sharing yours beforehand. I just need to begin by saying that what I'm about to share with you will be different from Emma in the sense that I'm going to try and take you through my journey, which will begin from as an undergraduate. Because there might be some of you in the audience who are pursuing at undergraduate level, then through to master's level. How did I get, indeed, as Tony has just said, from the undergraduate experience through to doing a PhD and actually into lecturing at university? How did that happen, and what were those experiences? But I begin by letting you know that currently, or at least what I'm trying to do is share my experience, not because I want to appear arrogant. I've attempted to do this in the past, and I think it can come across as, oh, look at me, I've achieved this amazing thing. But actually, I want to share them because I do, and I don't think that it's a unique experience either, what I'm going to share. But I do say that I share them because I feel any African woman or man who goes through this process of academia and comes out at some end where they feel that they've achieved and they feel successful in it, they deserve to feel a sense of pride, because it is usually quite an alienating experience. And actually, the achievement and the experience has been as a result of a lot of struggle. So in some ways, I share it as a matter of pride, that I've come out at some end and I'm still alive. I teach creative writing and literature at London Metropolitan University. And I have worked at the university since 2000. I didn't start there as a lecturer. I started there as a quality officer. What does a quality officer mean? It's really an administrative job. And I started there, it was a kind of strategic move, as I'll come to later. But I started there because I wanted to come away from being in the city, where at the time I was working. So I wanted to be in a university or in a what I thought was a giving back kind of community environment. Anyway, I completed my first degree and my master's at London Metropolitan University. At first it was University of North London, before it merged with London Guildhall. And it was there that I also received my PhD. So I worked there as an administrative role. I finished my undergraduate degree there, and I did my master's there and my PhD there. So I really had principally one experience of academia. And I'll try to explain why that was. Whilst doing the PhD, I was asked to teach a number of modules, and I've continued teaching since that time. So what they do is, as part of your doctorate, they say, oh, would you mind teaching some modules that your supervisor might otherwise be teaching? But if they have a sabbatical, they'll say, do you mind teaching it? And I said, yeah, okay. It will give me experience. At that time, I wasn't really thinking about teaching. I wasn't thinking of anything beyond what I was doing immediately in terms of studying. So that's how I've continued teaching there. I must say that I'm teaching at the London Metropolitan University as an hourly paid lecturer. there's something about prostitution in that when I hear myself say an hourly paid lecturer. It really means that I will get paid for 3 hours, even though effectively I will spend 10 hours or more preparing for my classes, preparing to teach. But I'll only get paid for 3 hours. And it's been that setup since I started the PhD. I'll explain about when I was doing the PhD. So, so it's important that we understand that I'm not even fractional, because fractional means that when it's the end of term, when it's the holidays, you will be paid for that. It means an HPL that when it's my holidays, I don't get paid. Okay. I've already said that to you. But also something important about being at HPL I need to stress is that the students see you as a kind of a supply teacher. So you have to work that bit harder because they don't see you regularly. They know that you're not a full-time member of staff. So they find it difficult to necessarily respect. You have to really try that bit harder to earn their respect. Okay, so how I'm going to approach this theme is I'm going to try to discuss what I will consider secrets, and I think of those as a questioning of identity, about my identity in terms of that journey to where I ended up. Then I'll discuss what can be considered successes, and I'll call this success spiritual fortitude. And then I'm going to try to make some suggestions for coping at universities, which I'll call knowing and respecting the game. So secrets, or a question of identity. My experience in academia began in 1992. I enrolled at Stirling University in Scotland to read business studies. Even when I say it now, it's quite incongruous. Firstly, why Scotland? Secondly, why business studies? After completing a BTEC National Certificate in Business Studies, Stirling was the only university that gave me an unconditional offer. That's why I ended up at Stirling University. I chose to do business studies because I found it difficult to find employment, having completed secondary school with 90% CSEs. Does anyone know CSEs? So I had one O-level, one GCE at the time. This was before they were just in that time changing to GCSE. So I came out with one CSEs. And if you know CSEs, it's like, you're not going to get a job, that's just not good enough. You needed the O-level, and I had one of those. So at that time as well, there was a recession in the 80s and the early 90s. So furthering education implied there was a chance to, there might be an opportunity for employment. And that's still apparent. So we're now in another recession, and there are a number of us who, the job market is so big that we're now going, what can I do with myself? I'll just go and study. So we're in that same cycle. I entered Stirling University with my maiden name, Michelle Gordon. I should say maiden and also European. My first memorable experience at Stirling was of the teacher laughing when he looked up. He was calling the register and he called out my name, and he laughed because he was expecting me to be Scottish. I wasn't even conscious at the time of that, but when he laughed, I thought, oh, okay, it's because of the name. So when some Europeans say that, you know, their families or whatever actually it was Scottish at the time, said that their families weren't really necessarily interested in the slave trade or slavery, I would remind them of, well, my name is Gordon, and that doesn't make sense. In many ways it doesn't make sense, but my surname is Gordon, and that lecturer laughed at me to remind me of this incongruity. Business studies was soul-destroying. Why was I doing business studies? When I discovered that the university taught a degree called English with Commonwealth Literature, I changed courses. I was the only African student in the entire English department, and that includes the students as well as the teaching staff. I had classes. So obviously you're in this remote place and you're the only one of your kind in that department. So I was really, really uncomfortable. When I look back, I realised that I was also angry because I was being taught African and Caribbean literature by white lecturers who were considered experts in the subjects. And some of them had lived in Africa, and I envied this. You know, when they say, oh, you lived in Africa, this is not good. And some of them, one of the modules I took on African women writers was taught by a PhD student, just as I then later on will be teaching students. And I resented this. I didn't resent the fact that she was a PhD student, but she was dispassionate. She taught the subject in this kind of objective way. And I just thought she didn't really actually care. It was just something that she was doing. It's like, what can I do? Oh, I'll just study African women writers or whatever. And so I kind of I had issues with that. So I developed what I think of now as a petulant attitude. And I'll come back to attitude later. I wanted something that wasn't possible at that time, and really still is the case, to be taught, for once, by an African. Especially now, for the first time, I was being exposed to African and Caribbean writers under Commonwealth literature. So I was thinking, why aren't any African or Caribbean teachers teaching this subject? So that's what I wanted, but wasn't getting it. But this was the time that I discovered Toni Morrison, and it was a life-changing experience to discover Toni Morrison. In one of our exams, I wrote a piece on the bluest eye, interpreting a scene in the novel through my growing African-centered perspective. The marker's comment was that I was reading too much into the text. This is one of many instances where I realized there was no change in the game, that even when I had the chance to read works by African writers, I have to do so through that Eurocentric or Eurospective gaze that had discriminated against me since my arrival in the UK. So I'm still expected, even though I'm reading an African text or by an African American, and I'm seeing it through, I'm hoping, Toni Morrison's eyes. I'm feeling Toni. I'm like, yeah, I see where you're going with this. When I write back what I'm seeing, they're like, you're reading too much into that. And I'm thinking, no, I'm not. I'm feeling Toni Morrison. Anyway, but the course that I was doing had its main part, which was English literature and some language, steeping me further into Shakespeare, Milton, Chaucer, Bronte, and at the time, joyfully, Jean Rhys. We had to do a tedious linguistic classes, which I was permanently vexed in. My arms, I was just folded armed, just like, no, I don't really want to be doing this. I'm not part of it. I'm trying to be at the back of the class or just pushing up my face. I think the teacher who was teaching me had a double-barreled English name, so he was quite stuffy, I thought. So I was doing this petulant attitude thing, and he said in one of my essays back, he said, this student should be receiving higher grades. And I actually took note of this because I adjusted my attitude, because it was, at that time, it was really my attitude. So he was like, you could do better, but you've got an attitude. He wasn't saying that, but I was hearing that when I read that remark. So I was observed that he was not fooled by this petulance, and perhaps he thought me capable, and that actually helped me. I joined the African Society. I think this was because I was lonely. The alienation in Scotland forced me to contemplate my identity. I was holding out on being African. What do I mean by this? I was born in Guyana, so I'm really diasporic African. So at the time I wasn't really African. I was holding out on being African and actually wondered why the society wasn't called the African Caribbean Society. They ignored me, the African student. They thought, what, no way. Because I was actually trying to push for this at the time. Anyway, they ignored me gratefully. Being part of the society, I discovered an unconscious Pan-Africanism. And this is key to where I've ended up. I met Africans from across the continent from whom I was learning about that deeper part of my identity. I didn't realise it then, but I was battling single-handedly with the continental Africans because I wanted to hear the African Caribbean, or rather I wanted them to hear the African Caribbean perspective. But they thought I needed to come back to a centre. I needed to come back to being African. And I was like, but we've gone through, we've had a journey, we've had an experience, and you need to honour that experience as well. But they thought that I needed to really declare myself an African. And when I say they, I must stress that my alienation was double-edged because I was one of only 3 diasporic Africans in the African society. So there are a lot of continental Africans, but not that many diasporic Africans. And the continental Africans seem to think of us as second-rate, like we lacked some kind of authenticity, that somehow our experience didn't seem to matter. So I was feeling alienated from different angles. Rather, it was this growing sense of who I am. I was having to explore that, having to explore what it really means to be African. But in any case, I was most comfortable with the African students. With the Europeans, there was always this expectation of me to perform. I can't really say too much about that, but there was always this, you had to be black, particularly. Couldn't really be quite whatever African at that time meant to me, but somehow I always felt I had to perform. Anyway, having entered the university as an adult student, I was 22, but they classify you as an adult student from, I think, 21. And being the only African in my department, feeling not quite African enough and isolated from my family and my Guyanese root, I suffered from anxiety attacks and depression. I saw the university's counsellor to deal with the depression, which helped for a while, until he broke down in front of me, and I found myself, this is a true experience, I found myself counselling him, offering him tissues. I reasoned that I didn't need him after all. What I needed was to understand that root, my foundation. I took a year out and returned after 15 years to Guyana, where I was born. And there was the foundation. Africa would eventually become what I understood as my root, but the foundation where I actually came out of initially was Guyana. When I went back to Stirling, I had the confidence to write freely, to care little about the grades and the bias of the teachers, because this was inevitable. There's nothing I can do about this. They're going to be biased, and you need to understand this. So I would now please myself. I would now write for me and say in those writings what I wanted. Whatever essay they gave me, I wrote without trepidation of how they might feel about my bold assertions of identity. A particular example, we were asked to write a 2,000-word essay on Caribbean identity from the literature we were studying. I thought, 2,000 words is not really going to scratch the surface. It's not enough. So I wrote 5,000 words, and I received an outstanding grade for this. From then, my confidence was boundless. The confidence was brief, however, because there was still this counterpart. I still had to do this English canon. I still had to do Chaucer and Shakespeare and all of this. And I was really becoming more and more disenchanted with having to read Bronte and Chaucer, and it was like there was the colour of the Africa and the Caribbean, and then Chaucer, and it was heavy Milton, and it's like, no, this is uncomfortable. So I was no longer interested in reading them because they weren't really teaching me anything about myself. In my penultimate semester, I suffered what would be called a breakdown. In the end, I didn't complete my degree at Stirling. Faced with the possibility of being put into a mental institution, I returned to Guyana, recuperating for nearly a year. It would take another 4 years before I received my first degree. So I started when you go to Scotland to do your degree, it's 4 years, which I didn't realise at the time. So it's now going to take me 4 more years after I've had this experience to complete it. Success, what I call spiritual fortitude. While the breakdown might have been considered a failure in that I was unable to complete my degree as planned, I discovered my spirituality as a consequence. The phenomenal details of this spiritual awakening I'll share another time, but it led me to a better sense of self and purpose. I would continue my degree, but I changed the focus of my final year project. I wanted to understand what had happened to me. I couldn't and still do not accept that it was a mental breakdown per se. But for me, the experience was something remarkable. It revealed how split my psyche was in terms of identity and the bombardment over the years of Eurocentric ideas. And what might be considered schizophrenia or schizophrenic, mental or even crazy, especially when applied to Africans, might otherwise be a necessary break from the alienation and trauma of living in the UK. So in other words, it's almost that you've got to experience that, you've got to have that, or we're walking around with it somehow holding on to us and we're not actually productive and we can't really understand why, but we're living in an alienating, traumatic experience all the time. I completed my degree at University of North London and was awarded a first-class honours for my dissertation, recrediting the knowledge of African-centred spirituality. I'll say that again. Recrediting, whereas it was discredited, the knowledge of African-centred spirituality. My journey would now be to develop an understanding of my spirituality and know what it means to be African. My Pan-Africanism was becoming more conscious, whereas before it was an unconscious thing. I felt more self-determined because I knew what I wanted to do. I didn't have to stick with the English canons. I could choose my own course. I initially attempted to finish my degree at SOAS, but during the interview, I observed a kind of scorn on the face of the professor, or I think he was a registrar that was interviewing me. He directed me down the road to the University of North London. This I later realised was because the student demographic was mostly Africans and Caribbeans. But as I walked through the corridors of the African department, the African history department at SOAS, I saw one, because they've got a wall of faces. I don't know if it's changed, but these walls of faces, I was walking along, I was looking at them. There was one African in that department. She was the department secretary. In any case, North London turned out to be a blessing because the Caribbean Studies Centre was there. I felt at home there because it was in contrast to the bleakness of Stirling, the bleakness and the everything else of Stirling. Though the English department was still not represented by Africans, the small Caribbean Studies Centre had Rita Christian from Antigua and Clem Cicheran, my compatriot from Guyana. It was, however, headed by a European woman, Jean Stubbs. I have sometimes wondered about that racialised and gendered hierarchy. Clem was sort of deputy to Jean, and he was senior to Rita. Clem he'd written a number of books actually, and it took him a while before he made professor. So there was a kind of that hierarchy where Jean was ultimately going to be the head, and then you had an Indo-Guyanese male and Rita Christian on that other level. So I was kind of like curious about this. I wondered why it wasn't any other way around, because it was the Caribbean Studies Centre. I mean, obviously Jean Reese is, she's a Cubanist, so she had the expertise. So, with the recent closure of the centre, Rita's position actually is in some ways more marginal than mine, meaning that the university is uncertain where to place Rita because there's no Caribbean Studies Centre. So where is she actually, where they're going to put her? I know that they've tried to give her other roles, say to her, well, you're a teacher, you can teach anything. So we can just put you in some random subject that she's not specialist in. So there's that going on. I have to say that although all of the English tutors at University of North London / London Met have been Europeans, many have been supportive. That said, in the 13 years I've been at the university, none of my line managers have been African or any minority ethnic. 13 years, not one. I made a smart move that enabled me to do my master's. I applied to work as a quality officer at the university. That's how I really came to be there. It was largely administrative, so now I've been there, I've finished my undergraduate degree on a part-time basis, and I am then going to do my master's. So I applied at the university to work there. So it was including, the job, as I said, was administrative, included being a committee secretary, setting up validation of modules, and I could tell you about the way modules as well were validated in terms of, as a secretary, if they'd have to account how many ethnic minorities they recruit to modules. And one, I remember it was antique restoration or something, furniture restoration. And they're not recruiting any Africans to antique restoration. They were like, well, why not? And I remember them in this one, they asked me not to minute the details of that. So I'm sitting there, I'm writing, thinking, okay, and they said, oh, don't minute that. So even in the level of the detail, you can't see those shadows or those hidden secrets, if you like. Where was I? Oh yeah. There was a staff exemption scheme that allowed me to do my master's for free. So just in case, I don't know if that's still the case. But you could do masters at a university if they've still got it in place freely. When I started the department, there was one other person doing a master's. When they realised that I was making use of the exemption, because when I applied, I didn't say that I was doing the master's, because I didn't want them to think I was above the post that I was applying for. So I played down my abilities, if you like. Once I was in there, I applied for the exemption to do the master's. And the woman that interviewed me, my line manager, once she realised I was doing the master's, and she didn't have the master's, but she was my line manager, she became quite hostile to me and was just red marking everything I wrote. And she'd never have a direct conversation with me about it, but go through another line manager to do this. I later understood that it was because of this. The fact that I'm now trying to better myself, so-called. Anyway, although the staff exemption scheme didn't extend to the PhD, I was given a grant through, unlike Amma, who had to fund it herself. I mean, I had to fund it in terms of living expenses, but I didn't have to pay for the PhD, I didn't have to pay the fees for tuition. And that was given to me through the Caribbean Studies Department. I only undertook the master's, in fact, because my supervisor said I should. So I had a more positive experience with a supervisor. And I also pursued the PhD because it was suggested to me. I was just at finishing, getting through that undergraduate that took me 8 years. It didn't take me 8 years, but I had a lapse of mental capacity, really. Yeah, so the accomplishment was that because I now felt self-assured and that my spirituality was in some ways guiding me, I pursued a subject that would strengthen my identity. There were no experts at the university who could supervise me on Guyanese comfort. Believe me, Guyanese comfort, no one at that university knew anything about that. But I wanted to pursue that, and I said to them, this is what I want to do. But the thing was, at that university, they were very flexible, and they wanted me to do it as you wish. That could also be partly because I was African, and they wanted to do the token thing. Because how many African Caribbean students were doing PhDs? So they were like, here's one that's capable, we'll support her to do it, and therefore do it in whatever way you want to do it, if you can manage that. I had tried to apply for funding through the AHRC, but they would rather you do something that's quite straightforward. And Guyanese comfort is about spirit possession, it's about spirituality. They're like, sorry, can you do one on literature and just look at a couple of writers and do it that way? And I was like, well, no. I wanted to do it my way. And the university was supported. Just before the Caribbean Studies Centre closed down, I completed. So actually I'd stepped out a little bit and I was doing something enterprising. You'll see some flyers there of my Nubia Pamper. I was making products. I was doing something random whilst doing my PhD and thinking that I had all this time to do it in, but then there was this move to close down the Caribbean Studies Centre. So if I didn't intuitively, spiritually act on the fact that no, I need to stop doing this random other thing and focus on getting the PhD done. About the same time, they announced that they were closing down the centre. So actually the centre closed down at the same year that I finished.
Is that at London Metropolitan?
Yeah, London Metropolitan University. They closed down on the same year that I was awarded my PhD in 2009. That was when they announced the closure. So my main success, other than the spiritual strength that has helped me to complete my degrees, is that I'm proud of the opportunity to teach African students who generally seem pleased that they were being taught by an African. Coping strategies, knowing and respecting the game, as I call it. In anything we undertake, our attitude will determine whether or not we succeed, regardless of the obstacles. We need to have the right kind of attitude. Before every undertaking, and this is relevant to working or studying in academia as anywhere else, I think there is a need to do a kind of pre-assessment, or rather some kind of divination if you're spiritually inclined. So if I was now faced with the decision to work or study at university, I would ask myself some questions before making up my mind. That is, I would try to divine whether this was where I truly want to be. I'd ask myself, and I'd encourage you to ask yourself some questions. Why do you want to go to or work at university? Is it for the prestige or status, the need to give back, to compensate for the failings of secondary education, the need to prove something to yourself or someone because you feel cornered into it through lack of employment opportunities? Is it because no one else in your family has a degree or teaches at university? As Dr. Amabani said, we need to be clear about the motivation for pursuing a career in academia, for being an academic. What will you study at university? What are the options? And what would it lead to? Who will it benefit? How will it assist your personal development? If this is a journey you're consciously on, how will it improve who you are, where you're trying to be? Or is it some kind of delaying? Are you delaying something, the start of something more appropriate, but seemingly weightier in responsibility? Sometimes I wonder this about my creative writing students. If they just accepted a course, or they came onto a course because they're just like, it's easy, we just have to sit there and write, or not even. We don't have to do anything proper. We don't have to actually try to get a job. I wonder that about them. Have you properly assessed the material cost of studying? Are you reassessing the psychological cost of being in an alienating environment, which is the experience overall of living in this country? The intensity of academia, poring over books, can be a mentally destabilizing experience. A number of academics are depressed, this is true, or alcoholics. This is true. This is due to pressures not only of teaching but researching and producing papers on demand. I don't even have time to go into the debt that I have as a result of pursuing my studies. Do you have the character to commit to long-term periods of study? How will it impact your life, as Emma's already given, thankfully, all those examples? How will it reward you if you manage to successfully complete? London Met was stripped of its funding because most of its students, black and ethnic minority, were not completing the courses for which the university was receiving hefty funding. That was why that money was taken away. The students weren't finishing. Do you need to study in the UK? Will studying abroad give you a better overall experience and perhaps broaden your life's experiences? Some universities will fund your study abroad, and that's something for you to consider. I could have gone to America to do my PhD. I was actually offered a place where they would pay for and give me a stipend, but because of family, I decided, and also the alienation thing, I didn't really want to do that. But that opportunity was there. Do you have the right kind of support? As again, Emma said, this is important. Who can you rely on when things aren't working out, financially and psychologically? Few family members were in a position to lend financial support, but I had friends who kept me afloat. As a lecturer, I have been generally well supported because London Met has some progressive members of staff who are generally interested in the development of the students. They are committed to the original vision of that university of inclusion to students from non-traditional backgrounds. This does not mean that I couldn't relate any instances of discrimination, or many rather, that should be. Support might mean also using the structures and services in the university to help with your academic performance. As a lecturer, you need to identify a friend among the enemy. That's what I found at the university. To survive in academia, you will have to lose the attitude of victimhood. Self-pity and anger don't mix with good thinking. You'd have to fix your face. When you're being taught by a European, it's nothing new. Even if they're teaching you about Africa or the Caribbean or falsely representing their own history by denying the link between slavery and capitalism. Fix your face, but develop the character and confidence to boldly challenge their misrepresentations. Your boldness must be tempered. Emotionalism also blights good thinking. There's an example, but I'll maybe wait for questions that I could speak to about that. Don't cloak yourself in the syndrome of being that angry black woman. Yes, you have a right. We know our struggle is justified. We are oppressed because of our race, our gender, and our class. It's true. We don't expect special treatment because of this, however. But we want to be respected for the quality of our work, which brings me to a significant point. In whatever sphere of work we find ourselves, many Africans will work to a high standard, trying ever harder to prove ourselves. But some of us won't, because we expect special treatment as a kind of payback for the injustices we've suffered. I'm aware of situations where Africans have been awarded degrees because they've tried racism. It can work. But for me, it doesn't advance us individually and collectively. We must live up to our integrity. We must be treated equally because it is our right, not because we are pitied. Spiritual fortitude will alleviate some of the psychological trauma that comes from always being in a hostile environment. Without fortitude, you can be self-determined and choose your own path. If you desire to stay in academia, you must have a clear understanding why. I support the campaign to stop British universities discriminating against black academics, but I'm not optimistic that this will be a reality. With the hiked university fees, many working-class Africans will be deterred from pursuing higher education. I'm not interested in teaching a class of predominantly middle-class European students, because that's the reality, that's what will happen. I see this as nursemaiding and strengthening the elite. My time at London Met, and perhaps in academia, will soon be up, as I've recently made the decision to leave the crumbling building of the university. But the departure, after varied experience, will, I hope, be a graceful one. Because to remain there, even though I am proud when the African students respond to the experience of being taught by me, an African woman, is to be complicit in my own exploitation, that sense of that prostitution element. I would sooner chart new territory, as many African academics have been forced to do, and shed the spectre of tokenism. Thank you for listening.